Once upon a time, there was a young woman named Francesca. She lived with her mother and stepfather, and when she wasn't tilling the soil, she was playing the harp. One day, to relax a while from all her digging, she took up her harp and she began to dance. As she grew closer to the corner of the field, she saw a mass of crows, shrieking and fighting and feeding on something. What was that? A chill crept down her spine. As she approached, the murder of crows flew into the air as one, and she caught a brief and shocking glimpse of a body. Eyes staring unseeingly at her. And in the next instant, the crows flew back down to their feasting. She put down her harp, took up her shovel, and began to dig. She dug until her muscles pumped, her blood pounded in her ears, and sweat trickled down between her shoulder blades. Poor man, she thought. Poor man. She felt again the stab of loss of her own dear father, who had never returned home from a trip across the waters long, long ago. She hoped, beyond hope, that someone had found his body and cared for it as she cared for this one. She covered the grave with fresh green boughs. She took up her harp and let her fingers wander where they would, paying her respects to this unknown soul. Returning to the spot where she had left her hoe, she was amazed to see that the hoe had begun digging all by itself. From that day on, Francesca was the happiest tiller alive. She would work until she was tired, and then while the hoe went on digging, she would pick up her harp and dance. While Francesca had happy days, her nights were not so. Her stepfather had never borne her any love, and many a time he had wished her gone. As a child, Francesca had become fleet of foot to flee his fists, and as a young woman, it was a different story. Her stepfather had often starved both Francesca and her mother as punishment for some imagined misdemeanour. When Francesca was a child, she would hide an apple in her room, plucked from a wild tree. At night, she would creep into the kitchen, take her mother's hand and press the apple into it, hoping beyond hope that her mother would eat it all up, as she was so thin her daughter could see her bones through her skin. But her mother would always shake her head, take out her knife and say, "Half for you and half for me, my love. Half for you and half for me." Years later, life held the same rhythm, but one night, one long, dark night, her mother took the apple and pressed it back into Francesca's hands. Both women were bruised and shaking. She told her daughter she must go, and Francesca knew in her bones it was so. With a heavy heart, she took her harp, her apple, kissed her mother, and left. Francesca travelled a long and weary and lonely road, for no one would give her any labour. Finally, she met an old beggar and asked him if he knew of any work in the fields to keep body and soul together. He shook his head, but told her she could join him on his journey, and they would share everything. She smiled, agreed, pulled an apple from her pocket and said, "Half for you and half for me." Time passed in the rhythm of the old beggar's days. One afternoon, he told her a tale he had heard of a poor king in whose fields nothing would grow. Many had tried, all had failed. The next day they set off for the barren lands. When they grew hungry, he took out the last of their bread, sliced it in two, and said, "Half for you and half for me." She smiled and said, "Half for me and half for you." They knew they had arrived when they found themselves walking through field after field after field of devastated and withered crops. Francesca put down her harp, took up her hoe, and began to work. From that day on, Francesca was once again the happiest tiller alive. She would work until she grew tired, and then, while the hoe went on digging, she would pick up her harp and they would dance. Little by little, day by day, week by week, month by month, the land was replenished and the crops began to grow. At the end of the summer, she was harvesting in the fields close to the king's palace. She was transported by the sound of haunting music in the air. Its poignancy touched her very soul, and the shock of hearing music other than her own made her stop her work, sit down, and simply listen. The melody was a balm to her heartache. Father, mother, home. The sound seemed to hold her heart and somehow heal it. She hung her harp in the tree and tiptoed up to the wall. Who was that? Day after day, she returned to the same field, until one golden evening she could not resist any longer, and she was compelled to take up her harp. The king had not opened the palace gates for as long as he could remember, but one evening he could wait no more. He threw the gates open wide. He held out his hand to her, and he offered her his palace, his lands, his heart, his everything. She took his hand, and as she stepped over the threshold, she suddenly remembered her friend, the old man, the beggar. In that instant, he appeared. He said, "Remember, we agreed to share everything." And he handed her their knife. He looked at the king, and he looked back at her. "You're right," she said. "You're perfectly right." With a trembling hand, she took the knife, and she raised it above the king's head. She was about to slice him in two when the old man took her hand and stopped her. He said, "I always knew you were a true soul. I am the dead man in the field who you buried. This is all my gift to you for your kindness. I wish you both well." And in that instant, he disappeared. The king turned to Francesca and said, "I would never accept half of you, but I will give myself to you wholly and eternally if you will wholeheartedly give yourself to me." Francesca stepped towards him. She took his face in her hands. She pressed her lips to his, and they kissed, and they kissed, and they kissed. It is said that their lives were so full of joy and abundance that even today, if you go up to the top of the hill, you will find that the wheat is always golden. And if you are a true soul, you will hear on the wind the sound of their enchanted music.